Good evening, Shavua Tov, good Vach, a good week to you, my holy sisters and brothers. Great to be learning with you on a Saturday night. Let's light up the darkness. Very special night. After class today, I'll just lay low for a few hours. And then we're going to have a singing kumsitz at a shul nearby starting at 11:30 p.m. To warm us up for slichas, penitential prayers that we start saying. The Sephardic Jews have been saying it for this whole month of Elul. Northern European Jews, Ashkenazic Jews start saying it tonight after Shabbos, preceding Rosh Hashanah. You need to have at least 4 days. The calendar is arranged that way. So we'll say slichas on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday in the morning, but that first night of it is right after Shabbos and after midnight. So it's actually starting at 1 a.m. here. And perhaps some of the people in our class are at their own slichas gatherings right now. Who's in the house? Joe in the Inland Empire, Shandor in the Bronx, Bella in Florida, Ella and Chaim in Florida. Welcome, everybody. Let's do it. Really interesting daf tonight. Our page is 99 here in Tractate Bava Basra, 23rd volume of the Talmud. Continuing our journey through chapter 6. And we're in one of those chapters, in one of those sections where the Mishnas start flying fast and furious, as we'll see. Right now, continuing our discussion of Mishnah number 4. Apropos the building of the sanctuary. So we were talking about measurements. If somebody asks a contractor to build, a small house on his property for one of his children, so what's going to be the minimum measurements so that it could be called a house? And one of the opinions was bringing down, well, we look at the measurements of the sanctuary, at least not in terms of a private home, but in terms of a gathering hall. And maybe we're going to get some of these minimum measurements from that. And one of the other opinions said, what are you talking about? The sanctuary is unique. Why would we compare any other buildings to the sanctuary? So that was yesterday, and now having discussed the measurements of the sanctuary, we're going to talk a little bit more about that. The sanctuary meaning the Holy Temple when it was standing in Jerusalem. So apropos the building of the sanctuary, the Gemara relates the following incident. Rabbi Hanina once went out to the villages to teach Torah there. And he raised a contradiction between two verses that detail the dimensions of the sanctuary. It is written, and this is from 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 2, and the house that King Solomon built for the Lord was 60 cubits in length and 20 cubits in width, and its height was 30 cubits. But it is also written, 18 verses later in the same book, and before the partition, and before the partition was 20 cubits in length. Before the partition, probably means in front of the partition, was 20 cubits in length and 20 cubits in width, and its height was 20 cubits. So the shortened length, that makes sense because we're talking about a room within the Holy Temple. So it's going to be shorter than that full length, meaning like the depth of the building. The width is the same, but the surprise at the height. Right, the first said it was 30 cubits high, and now it says that, well, this room in front of the partition was only 20 cubits high. So why is that? And so the first verse states that its height was 30 cubits, whereas the second verse states that its height was only 20. So Rabbi Hanina said to the villagers that the reason for the difference is that when the latter verse was calculated, or when the latter verse calculated the height, it did so from the upper edge of the cherubs and upward, as the cherubs themselves stood 10 cubits high. So 10 cubits, 15 feet high. Now, first thing we might remember is, okay, when in the Torah, right? I think where does it actually happen is, I'm not sure if it's in Exodus or Leviticus, probably in Leviticus. We're describing the Ark of the Covenant, right? That the tablets are contained in, and the first Torah written by Moses. That it was crafted and covered in gold, and on the Ark cover there were two angels, right? And these particular kinds of angels are called cherubim. We say in English cherub, which, you know, we get this connotation in our minds. A cherub, like a baby, is cherubic, right? Having beautiful baby face. But the cherubim are also, that word is mentioned about the warrior angels that guard the entrance to Eden after Adam and Eve are expelled from Eden. And so these are warriors with ever-turning flaming swords, not exactly these baby angels with little harps and wings. So now the angels that are on top of the ark are not necessarily baby-faced angels, but they're also not 15 feet high. So what are we talking about here? Well, we're not in the Torah. We're later on in the Bible, in the book of Kings, and we're talking about Solomon's temple. Right? So in Solomon, when Solomon built the temple, the first temple, so inside there were not only the angels on top of the ark cover, but sort of based on that, you know, style, which were created by Bezalel in the wilderness at the direction of Moses. Now Solomon sort of expanded the motif, and he created these very large statues of angels, which were located inside the temple, inside the sanctuary. So that's what we're talking about. And I mean, this is a very kind of small picture. I don't know if you'll be able to see that in the camera, but it gives a little bit of that feeling right there. If you can see that, I apologize, I don't have a nice bigger picture. But it's this idea of these kind of large towering statues of angels, and the you know, there's those two, I guess, that were in the Holy of Holies, but then there's a bunch of others in the sanctuary behind the curtain. Right, the Holy of Holies is where only the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, would enter on Yom Kippur. But the sanctuary was a little bit more accessible. Again, only Kohanim could go there. But there was also other stuff going on. And there were more of these statues of the angels, of the cherubim. So what we're talking about is, as we're talking about the dimensions of the sanctuary, why are we even talking about the angels that were standing in there? If really what we're talking about is a room that contains some statues, as well as the table of the showbreads and the incense altar, the inner incense altar. So let's keep reading. So Rabboni says that Shmuel says that, so in other words, there's a problem, right? Why would you say it's 20 cubits inside in one verse and 20 cubits tall in one verse, 30 cubits in the other? So now they're saying, well, it's 20 cubits from the top of the wings to the ceiling, but it's kind of an odd place to measure from. Why would you do that? So now we keep reading. Rabboni says that Shmuel says the cherubs stood miraculously. Did I skip something? Yeah, I skipped something. Okay, I went to the picture. Okay, so the Gemara asks, what is the verse teaching us by considering only the height above the cherubs? Now we're on page 99a. We started at the bottom of 98b. So the verse teaches us this. The area below the cherubs is like the area above them, and just as the area above the cherubs' wings, which were spread out in the air, was not used for anything, meaning it was empty space, so too the area below them was not used for anything and was empty. I feel like, okay, you can say that it's a kind of understanding of language. I feel like there's a deeper spiritual meaning that I have not yet grasped. I'm looking for that. Okay. This supports the opinion of Rabbi Levi. As Rabbi Levi said, and some say it was Rabbi Yochanan who said, this matter is a tradition handed down to us by our ancestors. The space occupied by the Ark of the Covenant and the cherubs is not included in the measurement of the Holy of Holies in which it rested, as miraculously it did not occupy any space at all. And the Gemara comments, this is also taught in a Baraisa. When they brought the ark that Moses crafted into the Holy of Holies in the temple of King Solomon, even though the total width of the Holy of Holies was only 20 cubits, nevertheless, the ark had 10 cubits of empty space between it and the wall in each and every direction. So now, perhaps we're getting at something that this idea, so what does that mean? I mean, was somebody in there with a tape measure and saying, well, this room is 20 cubits wide. We're going to bring in the Ark of the Covenant, which is, it's not such a large object. It was carried by the Levites in the desert. I forget the exact dimensions of it, but a few cubits, 2-3 cubits. And yet it doesn't take up any space. So is somebody in there with the tape measure? Well, the whole room is 20 cubits, but when I measure from the ark to that wall, it's 10, and from the other side of the ark to that wall, it's 10. And so somehow it doesn't take up any space. What are they telling us? Now, we do have a recollection from our ancestors that in the first temple, from when it was inaugurated by King Solomon, and as long as it was standing, this was a place of constant miracles. There were 10, I believe, miracles that were ongoing all the time there. And most of those miracles were not replicated at the time of the second temple. But that the showbreads were always fresh, like they smelled fresh baked even after being out there for a week. The fire that came and consumed, the sort of holy fire that consumed the olas, the elevation offerings. And I don't remember the list right now. But the point is, it wasn't just sort of procedural miracles. There was a sort of, how would you call it? Like you stepped into that temple and you knew that you were at that nexus between heaven and earth, the sort of stiffness of reality that we're accustomed to, where shelves are shelves and doors are doors and walls are walls and desktops are desktops, didn't apply there. It was a little bit more fluid. Reality, was bending a little bit before the presence of the Holy One, before the presence of that portal up to the spiritual world, which the Holy Temple represented. And the fact that that temple was eventually destroyed and is gone from this world, one of the reasons that Jews have longed for it for thousands of years since it was destroyed is not just that there are many mitzvahs, many commandments that we're not able to perform because we don't have the Holy Temple in our midst, but also because to be there, and in this week's Torah portion, we read about the Hakel, when the entire nation would gather in Jerusalem every 7 years to hear the king read. Some say the whole Torah, some say the last book, Deuteronomy. But there was this such palpable, spiritual, mystical sense of being there, being present, right, and witnessing, right, so that God, in the presence of God, the Shekhinah, the holy presence of God, that aspect of God that God allowed to be manifest in this place, it wasn't just talk, right? It wasn't something of the imagination. It wasn't just a matter of faith. It was something that you experienced when you were there. And whenever, we're blessed to have these kind of transcendent moments where we just get a little bit of a touch, a sense of that upper world. I've been blessed to have a few moments like that in my life. I hope that you have too. that kind of a experience was just part and parcel of being in the Holy Temple. And I think that when we talk about these measurements, it's not just numbers that we're talking about. It's a little bit of that essence and that feeling. Okay. Rabboni says that Shmuel says the cherubs stood miraculously and did not occupy any physical space. As it is stated, and 5 cubits was one wing of the cherub, and 5 cubits was the second wing of the cherub, 10 cubits from the tip of its wings until the tip of its wings. So accordingly, the wings of 2 cherubs standing side by side would occupy the entire 20 cubits, with the entire 20 cubit width of the sanctuary. But if so, in what space were their bodies standing? If their wings occupied the full 20 cubits and their wingspans were 10 cubits each, so then what about their bodies? Didn't the wings come out of their sides? And don't their bodies take up space between the wings? Since their wings alone, which protruded from the sides of the cherubs' bodies, occupied 20 cubits, there was no room left in which their bodies could stand. So rather, one must conclude from the verse that the cherubs stood miraculously and did not occupy any physical space. But Abaye objects to this proof. But perhaps they stood with their bodies emerging beneath their wings, like chickens, with their wings protruding above them from the same point in the center of their backs. If so, their bodies would stand beneath their wings and would not occupy any additional space. Rava also objects to this proof, that perhaps they stood so that this one was not next to that one, and the wings of the 2 cherubs overlapped, thereby allowing for the additional space required for their bodies. Rav Acha Bar Yaakov also objects to this proof, but perhaps they were standing in a diagonal alignment from one corner of the Holy of Holies to the diagonally opposite corner. In this way, there would be enough space for their bodies and their wings. Rav Huna ben Rav Yehoshua also objects. He says, but perhaps the width of 20 cubits stated in the verse refers only to the width at the ground level, whereas the room widened at the top and was therefore able to accommodate both their wings and the width of their bodies. And Rav Papa also objects, and he says, but perhaps they were folding their wings somewhat. Since their wings were not fully extended, they did not have to actually fill the 20 cubits of the sanctuary. And Rav Ashi also objects and says, but perhaps their wings crossed over one another, so that they did not occupy so much space. Now, a different question about the cherubs. How were the cherubs standing? And Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar disagree about this. One of them says their faces were turned toward the other, and the other one says their faces were turned toward the house, meaning toward the sanctuary. So these are the 2 statues of angels, right? As I mentioned, I'm standing on either side of the Ark of the Covenant within the Holy of Holies. And how were they turned? Were their faces facing each other, or were their faces facing out toward the sanctuary, meaning toward the partition that divides the Holy of Holies from the sanctuary? Now, this question mirrors the same question about the cherubim, about the angels that were built into the golden ark cover. And we've learned elsewhere that at times they were facing each other, and at times they were facing out toward the people. And here we're going to have the same parallel discussion. And the Gemara asks, but according to the one who says that their faces were turned toward one another, isn't it written in 2 Chronicles 3:13, and their faces were toward the house? How does he explain the meaning of this verse? And the Gemara says, this is not difficult, la kasha, as their faces miraculously changed directions in reflection of the Jewish people's relationship to God. Here, when it states that the cherubs faced each other, it was when the Jewish people do the will of God. And there, the verse that describes the cherubs facing the sanctuary and not toward each other was when the Jewish people do not do the will of God. And the Gemara asks, and according to the one who says they stood as described in the verse, and their faces were turned toward the house, isn't it written with their faces one toward the other in Exodus 25:20? How does he explain the meaning of this verse? And the Gemara answers, they were angled sideways so that they turned both toward each other and toward the sanctuary. As it is taught in a Baraisa, Onkelos, the convert to Judaism, who translated, one of the first translations of the Torah to Aramaic, Onkelos, the convert, said that the cherubs were of the form of children. As the verse states, and in the Holy of Holies he made 2 cherubim of the form of children, and they overlaid them with gold. 2 Chronicles 3:10. And their faces were angled sideways toward the Ark of the Covenant, like a student taking leave of his teacher. Now, about this idea of form of children, and this is where we get this idea that cherub and cherubic refers to a childlike face. The Gemara in Tractate Chagiga explains that the word for cherub, keruv, is similar to keruvia, which is Aramaic for like a child. And this is also how Onkelos translates the word in his translation of the Torah. And similarly, most commentaries explain that tza'atzuim is a cognate of tze'atzaim, meaning children, and that the cherubs' faces were formed to look like children. So it may or may not be so. We're getting that, as a kind of something inferred from the language, somewhat from Aramaic. Aramaic related to Hebrew, but much more of a lingua franca, right? The language that everyone spoke, and not as old or as high and holy as Hebrew. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 4 here in chapter 6. Now, Mishnah number 5. One who has ownership of a cistern located beyond the house of another, i.e., the cistern can be accessed only by entering the property of the other person, and the owner of the cistern also has access rights to that cistern, so he has the right to pass through the other person's property in order to access his cistern. Well, he may enter the house to access his cistern only at a time when it is usual for people to enter, and he may leave only at a time when it is usual for people to leave. And in addition, he may not bring his animal into the house and water it from his cistern. Rather, he must fill a pail with water from the cistern and water his animal outside. And this one, the owner of the cistern constructs for himself a lock on the entrance to the cistern to prevent the homeowner from drawing water from it. And that one, the homeowner, constructs for himself a lock. Right? So the only way for you to get to your water cistern is to go through somebody else's property, because it was probably his cistern. He needed money. He sold you the cistern. It wasn't going to be of any use to you if you couldn't access your cistern. So he also sold you access through his house to go. So now what the Mishna is telling us, okay, it's your cistern, and you have a right to walk through this guy's house, or at least his property, to get to your cistern, but you don't have an unlimited right to go there any time of day or night. You're going to go during reasonable hours. And there's going to be a lock on both sides of the door to the cistern. Let's see why. The Mishnah states that the owner of the cistern and the homeowner each construct a lock. The Gemara asks, a lock to where? And Rabbi Yochanan says both of them construct a lock on the opening to the cistern to prevent the other from accessing it unilaterally. The Gemara asks, well, granted, the owner of the cistern constructs a lock as he wants to protect the water of his well. Why does the homeowner construct a lock? And Rabbi Lazar said he does so due to a suspicion that the owner of the cistern might enter the house at a time when the owner of the house is not present, and thereby be secluded together in the house with the homeowner's wife. Lest suspicion fall on them for that reason, we have 2 locks. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 5. Now, Mishnah number 6 on page 99b. One who has ownership of a garden located beyond the garden of another, and also has access rights to it, may enter his garden only at a time when it is usual for people to enter, and may leave only at a time when it is usual for people to leave. And furthermore, he may not bring merchants into his garden, and he may not enter the garden solely in order to use it as a passageway, to enter from it into another field. And the owner of the outer garden may sow, S-O-W, the path leading to the inner garden. If the court gave him an access path from the side of the outer garden with the agreement of both of them, he may enter at any time he wants and leave at any time he wants, and may bring merchants into the inner garden. But he may still not enter the garden solely in order to enter from it into another field. In such a case, neither this one, the owner of the inner garden, nor that one, the owner of the outer garden, is permitted to plant the side path. Okay, so it's similar to the case of the cistern. If the only way to get to your garden that he sold to you is through his property, you can only go at reasonable hours, and you can't bring other people into your garden by going through this guy's property. But if you're given an access through a side path where it's going to be much less intrusive, you're just going to go up the side of the property. Okay, so then you can bring other merchants to look at your garden, etc. And in the first situation, the owner of the garden is permitted to sow on that path, right? He can plant seeds. The owner of the outer garden may sow the path. In other words, he can plant so he doesn't lose that space from his crop, as it were. And he's also permitted to do it on the side path, right? Because the walking to in and out of the inner garden, okay, he's going to crush some of those plants, but most of them will grow. And why shouldn't he grow since that path is through his own property? That's the Mishna. Now the Gemara. Rav Yehuda says that Shmuel says, if a field owner says to another, I am selling you from my land a water channel fit for bringing water to an irrigated field. So he's required to give him land 2 cubits wide for the inside of the channel, and 1 cubit on this side and 1 cubit on that side for its banks. Right? If I'm selling you a water channel, what does that imply? A water channel that's 2 cubits wide, right? So that's about 3 feet wide and 1.5 feet on either side for the banks of that water channel. If we specify measurements in our deal, we could have different measurements. But if we don't specify, this is the minimum. If he said to him, the seller, I said to him, I'm selling you a shaduf, also known as a kilon channel. This is a different kind of water channel. He is required to give him land 1 cubit wide for the inside of the channel and 0.5 cubit on this side and 0.5 cubit on that side for its banks. And the Gemara asks, and with regard to those banks, who has permission to sow them, right, to plant on the banks? And Rav Yehuda says that Shmuel says the field owner may sow them with vegetables or crops. Rav Nachman says that Shmuel says the field owner may plant them with trees. And the Gemara elaborates, the one who says that the field owner may sow them, may plant there, holds that all the more so he may plant them with trees. And the one who says that he may plant them with trees holds that he may plant only trees. But sowing them with other kinds of plants is not permitted. And this is because the roots perforate the ground, which weakens it and can cause damage to the water channel. And Rav Yehuda says that Shmuel says, with regard to a water channel whose banks collapsed, the owner of the channel may repair it with earth from that field through which the channel runs, even though the field does not belong to him. It is permitted because it is known that when its banks collapsed, the earth that the banks were made from spread only into that surrounding field. Right? Where did that dirt go? It's in this field, so he's able to take some dirt, maybe not the exact same dirt, and repair the banks. And Rav Papa objects to this, but let the field owner say to the owner of the channel, your water in your channel carried away your earth from your banks, so you have no right to take earth from my field. So rather, Rav Papa said that he may repair the banks with earth from the field, but for a different reason. Because when the field owner sold the rights to the channel, he accepted that condition upon himself, that from time to time, earth would be required to repair the banks and it would be taken from the surrounding field. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 6. Like I said, near the end of the chapter, they often come fast. Now, Mishnah number 7. In the case of one who had a public thoroughfare passing through his field, and he appropriated it, and instead gave the public an alternative thoroughfare on the side of his property, the law is that the thoroughfare that he gave to the public, he gave it to them, and they may use it. But the original thoroughfare that he took for himself has not reached him, i.e., he cannot appropriate a public thoroughfare that runs through his land for his own use. once it's been established as a public thoroughfare, he's not going to be able to just say, well, I don't really want the public walking through my field. I want to plant something here that requires all of this space. I'll give them an alternate path. And now they could just go on the alternate path. They're going to get to where they're going to go. It's just a little bit of a detour. And I get back the middle of my field where the public thoroughfare was. And the Mishnah is saying, well, what you gave them with the new path, you gave to the public. But you can't appropriate that public thoroughfare even though it runs through your land. Now, the standard width of a private path is 4 cubits. If a field owner sells the right to pass through his field to an individual without specifying the width of the path, he must provide him with a path 4 cubits wide. The standard width of a public thoroughfare is 16 cubits. That's quite a bit. And the width of a king's thoroughfare has no maximum measure, as the king may appropriate whatever width thoroughfare he wishes. Beware having a king. And the width of the path for the burial procession to a grave has no maximum measure. And with regard to the practice of standing and comforting the mourners following a funeral, the judges of Tzipori said that the standard requisite area for this practice of comforting the mourners as they walk by, that area the size of that area is the area required for sowing 4 kav of seed. That's Mishnah number 7. Now the Gemara. So the Gemara asks, why does the Mishnah rule that the public thoroughfare that the landowner took for himself has not reached him? If by making the exchange, the original thoroughfare now belongs to him, let him take a stick and sit on the thoroughfare and physically prevent anyone from passing through. So apparently the sages did not permit him to do this. So the Gemara suggests, does it follow that one can conclude from the Mishnah's ruling that a person may not execute judgment for himself, even in circumstances where refraining from acting will cause him a loss? But this would contradict the accepted law that one may do so. And Rav Zevid, and I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. Rav Zevid said in the name of Rava, although generally one may do so, in this case the sages issued a decree prohibiting it, lest he give the public a circuitous route that will lengthen the distance that they have to travel. So Rav Misharshia said in the name of Rava that the ruling of the Mishnah applies only where he actually gives them a circuitous route instead of the original straight thoroughfare. But one may exchange a public thoroughfare for an equally straight thoroughfare, appropriating the original for his personal use. So if you're only giving them a slight detour, okay, you can do it because it's your property and you're going to have a lot of benefit from that. And if they didn't let you do it, like what would the public lose? That they walk an extra 10 seconds just a little bit that way and then go straight. Whereas you now have one field instead of 2 fields separated by a public thoroughfare. On the other hand, if the alternate route that you're going to give the public is going to take them into the woods, then it's an extra half mile, so then you're not going to be allowed to do it. And Rav Ashi said, and now we're at the top of 100a, any alternative path on the side of the original path is considered a circuitous route, as it is close for this person and it is far for that person. While some will benefit from the change, it will be detrimental to others. Therefore, one may never exchange a public path for an alternate path. So that's a big difference in rulings. So where did the halacha came out? If one, this is from Shulchan Aruch, if one has a public thoroughfare passing through his field and he takes it for himself and instead provides the public with an alternative thoroughfare on the side of his field, then the public has the right to use both thoroughfares. The Sma, one of the commentators, maintains that this law applies only if it is a thoroughfare for the general public, including travelers from out of town. If it is a public thoroughfare only for people in his area or in his city, he may provide a substitute thoroughfare with the permission of the public. So that's where that law ended up. A couple of comments from Bill. Perhaps what we're dealing with here is that space-time is space-time even when holy. Let me unpack that a minute. So time and space are, we now know, inherently connected. Yes, that's quantum physics, right? And we often speak of Shabbos and liturgy in general as liturgical time, suggesting that in these set-aside moments we experience in a muted way, time as God does, all moments fully themselves and fully connected. In the space of the Holy Temple, therefore, we're dealing with the space end of that equivalent, meaning the space aspect of this space-time equivalent, space-time connection. So if in worship we go into liturgical time, God's time, and wherever the ark was housed was God's space, then when those come together in the temple, we are sort of almost, but not quite, fully stepping into God's space-time. Reality as God sees it, or as God means us to see it, as God will help us to see it, if we would but turn our hearts to Him. Beautiful. Thank you, Bill. Beautiful. And Bill also says, can a field owner purchase the former public thoroughfare from the public? Say he enters into an agreement with the local municipal government, which stands as representatives of the public interest. And it must be that you asked that question before I read that halacha. So it's possible. And then the question is, well, who are these representatives of the public? Today we would say the city councilmen, right? They're the elected representatives of the town. Back then, were they really elected? Was it more of a, that's why they said it's local, right? And if people from out of town are passing through, you're not going to be able to shift over that thoroughfare. But if you're dealing with the people of your own village or your own city, so then there's got to be some kind of understanding of who the elders are. And it's funny, today at our Shabbos Kiddush in Shul, in our synagogue, somebody had sponsored the Kiddush and was asked to say a few words, and he's very involved behind the scenes in running our synagogue. And he very graciously said, behind the scenes, so many people are involved, all on a volunteer basis, making things happen so that, when we come to daven, to pray here, the food is here, the chairs are here, things start on time, end on time. We move seamlessly from the prayer experience to the Kiddush and eating experience, etc. And that's all because there's all these volunteers. And it's those volunteers who get involved, basically end up assuming kind of that steering committee role in our community now. And I would say that, villages and perhaps cities as well, especially in ancient times, had that same feeling, right? There are those people that get involved and are willing to take on the work, and then are also going to be trusted to, have leadership, and maybe among themselves they discuss and vote. But not necessarily we're going to put everything to a vote of the whole population. That's the feeling that I get about this. That's what I've got for us tonight. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Sunday at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night.